Now, This Week in Texoma.
Welcome to the program. Our guest today is an author. Her name is Thaisa Tui, and she has written a novel called The 5 O'Clock Follies, What's a Woman Doing There Anyway? And it is a novel that details the press in Vietnam, but centers around a woman war correspondent, and she is the hero of the story. And we wanted to talk a little bit more about that novel today with the author. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
It's fiction, and I think that's the thing that hasn't been done about the press in Vietnam. The press did what the press normally does. They wrote memoirs, they did collections of their work, that sort of thing. But no one seems to have sort of studied the situation and turned it into fiction. So you can throw a little romance in there and hope to make it a page-turner. And, of course, my heroine is sort of like the Perils of Pauline. I mean, she hits, every major battle. She was around for the Tet Offensive and at the siege of Khe Sanh, and tried to get into Hue. So she hits them all, and that's another thing that's good about fiction, is you can hit all the high points with one person.
But it does work as good history too for people who are fans of the Vietnam War. I know whenever I was in school, I was fascinated by. I did a few things in that, and so I enjoyed the parts about that. For the history buffs can go in and get some decent detail of some of those battles and some of those places that you mentioned. So and it makes the history come to life. We'll talk a little more in detail about some of the book. But first, give people a little bit about your own professional background.
Well,
in terms of being a writer.
I just kind of been around forever. I worked for 5 different daily newspapers, starting out with the Yonkers Herald-Statesman and ending up at Newsday on Long Island in New York. Worked at the Detroit News, the Detroit Free Press, and the Newark Star-Ledger. I'm trying to remember all of them. There were so many of them. And then I worked for the Associated Press for quite a long time. So my bona fides as a daily journalist are there.
Was that something that you wanted to do from the very beginning? When did you decide that being a news reporter was something that was interesting you?
Oh, I don't know. These kinds of things always kind of happen somehow. I went to Berkeley in California, and the big thing in my mind was to move to New York. I couldn't wait. I didn't stick around to pick up my diploma. The day I took my last final, I got on a train with my Army foot locker. I don't know if there's any significance in that.
Right.
And moved to New York, and then just kind of bummed around looking for something interesting. I worked for a children's encyclopedia for a while. I worked for 17 magazine, and then I was in Paris doing I don't remember what, just hanging out and looking for something interesting. Right. And I ran into some guy that told me really how to get your first newspaper job. They're very hard to get. Sure. And so I went to a small paper, the Yonkers Herald-Statesman, and did everything, including working in the composing room. So, and I loved it. I can't imagine ever having done anything else. There's just always something happening, something going on. You hop in the car with a photographer and you're putting your lipstick on while you're racing off to a bank robbery. And I did an awful lot of desk work, signing. I was the first woman assistant city editor at the Detroit News, which at that time was largest afternoon paper in the country.
I was going to say.
So that was a challenge. They're not too used to women in the newsroom, much less somebody trying to tell a whole bunch of, of wild stallion, very young,
headstrong men.
What to do, but
And that's
I
kind of one of
managed.
the, and that's one of the kind of one of the the themes of this
Exactly.
novel as well. And I'm sure,
Exactly.
and that's kind of what I wanted to ask a little bit about. I mean, although the war environment obviously is is in and of itself quite a challenging thing, but just the role of a woman. Did you find that as an obstacle everywhere you went?
Sort
In
of
the
yes,
early days?
yes and no. It was an obstacle, but I didn't pay much attention. I just, if one guy didn't want me, then I just sort of went on to the next one. And I have a lot of funny stories about when I went to work at the Newark Star-Ledger, for example. I went in for a tryout, and the guy's like, well, I didn't go out for a tryout. I went in looking for a job,
Sure.
and the guy's like, well, I don't know. We never had a woman before, but I'm completely, some guy just quit on me and somebody else is sick and I'm really short-handed. And all right, he said, since you're here, I'll give you a try for a week. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, fine, but how heavy can a number 2 lead pencil be?
That's good.
So it was, as I say, it was an obstacle in some ways, but I don't know. I was a product of the era too, so when people said they didn't want me around, I kind of understood, that I really should have been back home behind a stove or something.
Fitting that stereotype.
Yeah, and I just, I didn't want to, I didn't know I wanted to get in the news business. I just wanted to do something interesting. And when I first went to New York, I'd go into a employment agency and they'd say, first of all, they didn't know Berkeley from UCLA and they kept thinking I'd gone to USC or UCLA. And,
Right.
and I'd say, they'd say, well, what do you want to do or what are you qualified for? And I'd go, well, I just want something interesting.
Yeah.
So that's how I fell into it,
Right. And it's turned out to be quite a ride. It sounds like
Yeah.
we need to take a quick break and we're going to continue our discussion. Our guest today is Thaisa Tui. She is a longtime news reporter, but also a novelist. The 5 O'Clock Follies, What's a Woman Doing Here Anyway? A Novel of the Press in Vietnam is her new book. We're going to continue talking about it in just a minute. Stick around.
If you have a topic or issue you'd like us to focus on, please write to the address on your screen or fax us at 357-3811. Or you can email us.
Welcome back to the program. Our guest today is Thaisa Tui. She is a writer, a news reporter, and also a novelist. She has a book called The 5 O'Clock Follies, What's a Woman Doing Here Anyway? It's a novel of the press in Vietnam, features a female war correspondent doing her best to slog along with a bunch of male correspondents in the heat of the Vietnam War, set in 1968, the Tet Offensive going on all around them. It's really a nice read. I want to talk a little bit about your transition, so to speak, out of writing news and into a novel. Where were you in your professional career as a news reporter when the idea started to germinate that there might be a larger story that you could write, like this book?
I don't know exactly where it germinated. I don't know exactly. I wanted to write a story about a woman hero. Mm-hmm. I decided that heroines were always standing behind their man and looking after the kids and keeping the Indians from attacking the farm or whatever.
Right.
And so that was my initial idea. And I initially wrote it as a play. I was married to a drama critic at the time. Mm-hmm. And so the character, Angela Martinelli, was a character in a 3-act play mm-hmm. that I wrote, and she was a photojournalist. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of the beginning of it.
Sure.
And then quite some time later, I really decided that I wanted to try to make a novel out of it. At that time I was working at Newsday, working in the op-ed page, and a book came along into the slush pile. As we all know, there's millions of people with millions of books trying to get somebody to review
right.
them. And I ran into this book by Peter Braestrup, who worked at one point for the Washington Post. The book was called Big Story, and it was like this thick, and he wrote the book on a grant to set out to prove that the press had lost the war in Vietnam. So it was a marvelous place to start out because it was very, very detailed about where the press was during the Tet Offensive. Here's the AP office, here's the UPI office, here's the Continental Hotel, the whole thing. And it was like AP filed this story at a such and such a time, and 20 minutes later they had to make a correction. And his thesis basically was that because the press were all around the Continental Hotel, they all stayed around there, and the embassy wasn't very far away. When the embassy was bombed, when the Tet Offensive began, the press was right there. So they all went and reported, oh my God, the American embassy has been attacked.
Right.
And there are still people to this day that have that thesis that because of that instant
because of their proximity
because of their proximity to the embassy, that they all just were saying we're losing the war, or it's bad, and it turned the public against it. Whether that's true or not true, you know, people have different opinions about what was going on. But anyway, that's how I really started my research. And then for years, before Google, I spent an awful lot of time in the Mid-Manhattan Library in New York, just one by one, going through the history section on Vietnam. And I just read everything I could get my hands on, history, fiction, whatever.
And I would bet that would, and that's part, you know, what I kind of hinted at earlier in terms of some of the detail and how it does make a good history, is that, you know, some of us might have an idea of, you know, that long-term paper that we wrote in college where you had the note cards of this and that and the other thing, and I can imagine you were doing the same thing except times about 10,000, and figuring out then, I've got all these elements, but how do I get those together, and how do I get the facts in and yet still create a fictional story? When people look at writers, and especially if you write as much as you did, for news reporting, I think sometimes people don't understand the dramatic shift that it takes to take the terrific skills that you have as a news writer. They don't. The skills are okay, but it's a different set of tools that you have to do to put it into a book, and it's hard to explain, and equally hard for you to learn, and probably it's almost like learning a new language.
Exactly.
Maybe?
No. Absolutely, absolutely. I rewrote that book 7 times, tried to sell it, and people kept saying the setting is fantastic, it's so believable, you can smell the streets, you can feel the heat, but the story doesn't quite work. And I didn't know what they were talking about. And of course what had happened was I'd go pick up a book called The End of the Line, which is an entire book on the siege of Khe Sanh, which it turned out, this is parenthetical, had been written by a guy who used to work for me, and when he was working for me, I didn't know he'd written that book. But anyway, I would do Khe Sanh, and I'd sit down and I'd write, and I'd think, great, I'd do a whole chapter on Khe Sanh, or I'd do a whole chapter on Hue, and of course I had the same female correspondent character, but I didn't seem to quite understand the circular nature of fiction. It took me years to kind of dope out that journalism is linear and fiction is circular. You really, those things that happen to the characters and things they see or things they remember or things they notice have to kind of keep coming back for the reader. People say it's a page turner. How do you keep holding the reader in there? And the way you do is the reader keeps kind of seeing signposts, things along the way that I remember what she said about her mother, back on.
Right.
Anyway, I didn't know how to do that, and I had to go. I've gone into a couple of writers groups and got fantastic help with that, and working with fiction writers and people that know how to plot, which I didn't. I was still reporting.
Sure. Right.
That's what makes the book so vivid and true, is that I'm a reporter,
Right.
but that it took a very
Right.
long time for me. It took a long time to get it published because it took me a long time to understand the nature, sort
Right.
of fiction.
Well, the reporter skills definitely shine through, and then you're obviously a quick study when it comes to learning how to write fiction. Just reading some of the capsule reviews that you got,
Yeah.
you have to be pleased with some of those reviews.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break and come back and continue our discussion with the Asa Toohey author in just a minute.
If you have a topic or issue you'd like us to focus on, please write to the address on your screen or fax us at 357-3811. Or you can email us.
Welcome back to the program. Our guest today is Asa Toohey. She's an author and also a journalist. She's written a novel called The 5 O'Clock Follies, What's a Woman Doing Here Anyway? It's a novel about the press in Vietnam. Let's talk about the title, The 5 O'Clock Follies. It refers to the daily briefings that the military gave during the course of the war in Vietnam. They'd bring everybody into a room and they would say, here's what's happened today. That happened at 5 o'clock. And the reason it was the Follies was because the reporters weren't really convinced that the stuff that they were given were
Yeah,
actual
yeah.
facts, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The military press office had this in Saigon every day at 5 p.m. And the guys that really wanted to know what was going on would go out in the field to find out. They were always getting, the body counts of the Viet Cong, and we didn't lose any troops, and this kind of thing. So that's where the title comes from. A funny aside is that just the other day I ran into a guy who came to one of my book signings that I had worked with at Newsday, and he had been a PIO, a press information officer in Saigon, and of course that he recognized the title, and that's why he wanted to buy the book. And he said he knew the general that had come in and decided, we're having such a difficult time with the press, we got to change the name of this thing. And so they started calling it the 4:30. We're going to hold the press briefing at 4:30, hoping that would help the relationship between the press and the military.
Do you want, as people read this book, because you also want it to be a page turner because it is an adventurous.
Oh, yeah.
It is an adventurous story. You've got a heroine that's being held captive by the Viet Cong. She makes her way back out. She's
Right.
trying to figure out. And bombs and explosions and wars happening all along. So in and of itself, the adventure itself is a strong story. But since it is called the 5 O'Clock Follies, do you also want to keep that in the forefront of that uneasy relationship between the military and the press, and how that can get muddled to the point where the people who are seeing the press reports might understand that there might be that kind of division in there? You see where I'm kind of going with that?
But part of the thing that as long as I've been in the press, one of the things is that the public so often doesn't trust us all that much.
Right.
And probably to some extent with good reason.
Right.
I mean, there are people that don't do their job properly, or I hate to say it, but certainly more than once we know of people that have made stuff up.
Sure.
But basically, my feeling is that, and many of the grunts out in the field would say the same thing to the press guys that were out there. What are you doing here? You didn't get drafted. You don't have to be here. And that's what I think is amazing, and that's, for me, why it seems like an important story to tell, is that they're out there doing their job too,
Right.
and letting the public know.
Right.
I don't mean to diverge at all, but 5 or 6 or 7 reporters have already been killed in Syria.
Sure.
And we do not have a boot on the ground.
Right.
So, you know, this is part of something that I would like for people to see the press as sort of just ordinary people, and we're not all bad guys, and we're not ghouls. A lot of people said that, you know, why are you here covering a war? You know, are you war junkies? Maybe so, you know, because they didn't have to be there.
Right.
But to me, I think it's just like a major job, and I have tremendous admiration for the people that did that.
Yeah, there is a terrific amount of bravery that does go unnoticed because, like you said, they are going in there and they do have a reason. They want to make sure that the story is told properly, and they want to share that if there is injustice and some of our brothers and sons and daughters who are out there fighting, if they're there unnecessarily, someone needs to share that story because we might not necessarily get it directly from the government because of that whole idea that they've got a different storyline that they're trying to follow.
Absolutely, and the division. There was a tremendous amount of contention between the press and the military during the war. And as I said, I started out reading a whole book about how the press lost the war because they were biased or whatever. But the contention had a real root in it. And this was that the government had gotten involved in that war very early on. It goes back to the history with the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And the press would say one thing that was happening, and the government would deny it. The government would deny that there were troops there. The government would deny that a battle had been fought. Early on, a battleship came up the Saigon River, or an aircraft carrier came up the Saigon River carrying a whole bunch of new helicopters. This was very early on, before we were in a war, before we were nothing but advisors. People stood at the riverbank of the Saigon River and watched this aircraft carrier bring in helicopters, and when the reporters would go check with the military or with the State Department,
there was no such thing.
Didn't happen. It didn't happen. There were guys that were injured in Vietnam, soldiers that were injured, and they could not get a Purple Heart because there was no battle, no war. So, you know, I mean,
without the press, you don't get those stories shared, and so that's what makes it such a vital.
You know, and so maybe the press is bad sometimes. Maybe the press doesn't get it right sometimes. But they're there. They're doing a job, and without them, where would we be?
There's a reason that they mentioned it. The framers mentioned it in the Constitution. They recognize the value of it. We need to take another quick break, and we're going to come back and wrap things up with the Asa Toohey in just a minute. Stay with us.
If you have a topic or issue you'd like us to focus on, please write to the address on your screen or fax us at 357-3811. Or you can email us.
Welcome back to the show. Just a few minutes remaining with the Asa Toohey, AP correspondent, also a novelist. The 5 O'Clock Follies, What's a Woman Doing Here Anyway, is a novel of the press in Vietnam. We've been talking about how that dissension between the military and the government and the press had gone on in Vietnam, and I wanted to try to draw a few parallels to what's going on now. I know that when we started, for example, the war in Iraq, there was a big thing with embedded reporters, and they would go inside. And at the time, you know, people really thought, oh, that's good, we're going to get an inside look. And yet, there's something about that whole environment that felt just unsettling to me from the beginning, and I know you kind of share the same thing, is that once you're inside in that kind of environment, it really kind of strips away your natural instincts and abilities as a journalist.
Absolutely. Right? I mean, it just seems like to me it's the worst thing you can possibly do, is because you're in there as an American and as a human being, and you're with the troops and you care about them.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like you're suddenly one of them, and you can't then, you know, pull off and and take an objective view of the whole thing. I told you a little story earlier about a very early story I wrote about one of the first officers killed from the little paper I was working for at the time, the Yonkers Herald-Statesman, and went to his funeral, went to the gravesite. I got back to the office and I couldn't read my notes. I had cried so much. They were all... So, I mean, what good are you going to be as a war correspondent to be embedded with the troops? I mean, you're just, you're going to become one of them then.
And it's a difficult thing to turn down because, as you know, if you're having to depend on the 5 o'clock follies, now you're saying, okay, well, now I'm kind of stuck because I can rely on the government daily briefing to tell me what's happened, or I can actually be there, but then also run the risk that I'm going to have somebody over my shoulder saying, that's a story that you can't put out today.
Well, see, this is what's so fascinating about the Vietnam War. I mean, the journalists that I've talked to, the friends of mine that have read the book, they're like, did it really happen that way? Was it... Anybody could go to Vietnam. Anybody could go. Anybody could get credentials. You could go into the AP in New York with a letter from your newsletter from your church and say, I want to go to Vietnam. I'm paying my own way. And and AP would give you a camera and a roll of film. So guys were showing up, and women. That's how my person got there. She didn't have a network or a paper behind her. So she went on her own. And all kinds of people went on their own. And that's what was so chaotic about the situation, and that's what made the military so crazy. They couldn't control these people running around trying to tell the public what was going on.
Well, I do want to thank you for taking the time. It was a pleasure meeting you.
It was lovely.
It is a terrific book, The 5 O'Clock Follies, What's a Woman Doing Here Anyway? Thea Satui has been our guest. Again, appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.
If you have a topic or issue you'd like us to focus on, please write to the address on your screen or fax us at 357-3811. Or you can email us.